Four souls are screaming toward our atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. For 5 minutes they are completely on their own. No comms, no telemetry, and zero room for error. That is not an accident. That is orbital mechanics. Now factor in a geomagnetic storm, avionics that have been frying in high-energy electrons for days, and a thermal protection system that has never been tested with human lives on the line. We are watching every known risk factor collide into one irreversible window. Stick with me, because the next 48 hours will determine the entire future of deep space exploration. If this high-stakes science interests you, subscribe to Skylab so you can track this mission data with us in real time. Leave a comment below. I need to know your coordinates, your local time, and your professional take on these mission risks. 4 humans at Mach 32 with a questionable heat shield and zero margin for failure. Is this a successful recovery or the start of a catastrophic investigation? Weigh in below. Now, let us analyse the data together. Part 1. The convergence event the public is completely misinterpreting. As we speak, 4 colleagues are hurtling toward the planet inside a pressure vessel that has never faced a re-entry profile this brutal with people inside. Yet the real technical dangers are being ignored by almost everyone in the industry. We usually focus on singular, catastrophic events, like a launch pad explosion or a sudden rupture of a critical oxygen tank. We look for that one dramatic failure on the mission clock where we can point and say, that is where the engineering failed. But Artemis II is different. Let us analyse the threat together. It is a compounding series of variables closing in on a 48-hour window. We need to reframe this. Stop calling it a journey or a homecoming. Those are just metaphors. This is a multi-system synchronization crisis, collapsing into a single atmospheric event. The crew has cleared the lunar sphere and is locked into the return corridor. Orbital physics does not allow for a second chance here. No abort to orbit, no parking, and absolutely no time for troubleshooting. Every mechanical sequence and environmental factor must align in a 5-minute window where this capsule either survives the plasma or burns up. The countdown to that window is running. Now look at this data because it is absolutely critical. For 5 consecutive days leading up to this re-entry, the 2 mega-electron-volt electron flux recorded by our satellites has been dangerously elevated, peaking at 7,359 particle flux units. That metric might sound like noise to you, but to a scientist, it is terrifying. People usually associate radiation with solar flares, those massive, violent eruptions of energy from the sun that hit us like a tidal wave. But that is not our problem today. This is not a sudden coronal mass ejection slamming into the Orion spacecraft's hull. This is far more insidious. The electron environment in deep space has been running hot for days. It is not a spike, it is a persistent, heavy soak. That distinction is exactly what changes our entire risk assessment. These high-energy electrons do not work like standard radiation. They do not cause immediate tissue burns the way protons do in a solar storm. Instead, they do something that keeps mission controllers awake at night. They slice through outer shielding and embed themselves deep into the insulating materials inside the spacecraft's primary electronics. They settle into the circuit boards and cable sheathing, the very materials designed to keep our electrical systems stable. The charge builds up silently for days, much like static electricity on a sweater in the dead of winter. But that sweater is the insulation for the flight avionics. The resulting discharge is not a spark, it is a massive voltage spike while travelling at Mach 32. Let us be clear about the physics here. This spacecraft is not approaching a radiation event, it has been submerged in one. The danger isn't a sudden external hit. It is the reality that internal systems have been slowly, invisibly degrading. We will not know the extent of the damage until the exact second we need those systems to perform perfectly during the heat of re-entry. The International Space Station deals with these electron charging events on a regular basis. Its massive solar arrays and metal frame act as a giant lightning rod to dissipate that charge. Even with those grounding systems and years of data, we still see mysterious discharge events whenever the electron environment remains elevated. However, the space station sits safely inside the magnetosphere. It has a magnetic shield overhead to deflect the worst solar particles. The Artemis II crew has no such protection. They have spent the return trip on the fringes, where the shielding is weakest. They are taking the full brunt of interplanetary space, with nothing between them and the radiation except the thin walls of the Orion module. This is where duration becomes more dangerous than intensity. A short spike is manageable. Charge builds, then naturally bleeds off. But 5 days of constant exposure means the electrical systems never get a chance to reset. The charge accumulates faster than it can dissipate. Insulation that normally handles brief exposure is now holding a massive trapped charge. We call this deep dielectric charging, and it is a critical concern. The discharge is completely unpredictable. There is no specific threshold or alarm to tell us when the insulation will finally fail. It happens when a sudden shift in temperature or vibration during re-entry finally breaks the material's limit. That breakdown is what we fear most. When does a spacecraft experience sudden temperature spikes, mechanical vibration, and material stress all at once during atmospheric re-entry? This is the convergence. Let's examine this thread together for the entire mission. This 48-hour window is not dangerous because of any single factor. It is dangerous because the accumulated invisible stress of days of electron exposure is about to hit the most violent thermal and mechanical environment the spacecraft will ever face. And it all happens inside a window where we have no abort options and zero chance for a second pass. There is no communication with the ground during those critical 5 minutes. The spacecraft is already in the storm, it just doesn't look like one yet. There is another variable at play, one that isn't discussed publicly because it lacks dramatic imagery or blaring alarm sirens. When high-energy electrons strike the spacecraft's metallic hull, they decelerate rapidly, creating secondary X-ray radiation called Bremsstrahlung. It is a German term. It translates to braking radiation. Crucially, the aluminium and steel designed to shield the crew from external particles are now becoming the primary sources of secondary radiation on the inside. Our shielding is actually emitting its own low-level X-ray field. It is not an acute biological threat to the astronauts. Not by any wide margin, but it is enough to introduce a subtle noise floor to sensitive electronics after days of exposure. This doesn't make the news because there is nothing for cameras to capture. No visible storm. The telemetry on our screens looks perfectly nominal. The crew reports feeling fine. Meanwhile, the public watching tracking feeds and NASA updates sees a spacecraft gliding smoothly home. The gap between what that looks like and the subatomic reality occurring inside the vehicle's walls at the particle level is enormous. Imagine a house that looks structurally sound from the street, while termites have been hollowing out the framing for a week. We would never know until the structure bears weight it can no longer carry. There is a hypothesis among my colleagues in radiation engineering, not yet consensus, that cumulative electron exposure of this duration may subtly degrade the spacecraft's avionics noise margins. These conditions won't cause failures or trip circuit breakers, but they shrink the margin between signal and noise just enough that under high-stress flight operations, error rates could climb, a random bit flip or a minor sensor misread. Nothing catastrophic when looked at in isolation. But inside re-entry, where automated responses must execute within milliseconds, those margins matter. Let's tie this back to where we started. The Artemis II crew isn't just approaching the danger zone. They've been inside it for days. This electron storm is not a future event on the mission timeline. It is the environment they have been marinating in. Every hour, the invisible load on internal systems ticks upward by an increment too small for alarms, but too real to ignore when you understand what follows. Because what comes next is a heat shield that has never performed exactly this maneuver before. A re-entry vector with zero room for error, followed by 5 minutes of plasma blackout, where the vehicle is just a sealed box falling through fire, totally isolated from us. That 48-hour convergence window isn't approaching. For this crew, it is already open. Everything from this point forward feeds into one irreversible moment. But before we reach it, we must discuss the one piece of hardware standing between the astronauts and 5,000-degree plasma. The unsettling scientific truth is that nobody knows exactly how it will behave. Not our engineers, the simulations, or even the material itself. Now, the heat shield decision that defines this entire mission. The Orion capsule's thermal protection is a material called AVCOAT. That name carries a lineage that sounds safe until we examine the data for this specific flight profile. AVCOAT is a specialized ablative thermal protection material. Its function is straightforward: absorb extreme thermal energy by sacrificing itself, charring and eroding layer by layer so that the structure behind it remains cool enough to survive. Apollo used a similar ablative concept. AVCOAT was actually a core part of that program's thermal protection heritage. NASA's choice for Orion seemed technically sound, a proven material with decades of data. However, after the Artemis I flight in November 2022, the heat shield returned to us with unexpected structural damage. The material shed in ways our pre-flight models never predicted. Large pieces of the ablative surface had cracked and separated. Char layers showed uneven erosion. NASA used the phrase loss of material, which sounds clinical until you realize what that actually implies for the crew. The thermal protection system failed to match our simulations on an uncrewed test, under conditions the vehicle was theoretically built to handle. The root cause, in the simplest engineering terms, comes down to the physics of flying a skip entry trajectory. During Artemis I, the capsule hit the atmosphere, pulled up to skip back out, then re-entered for its final descent. That skip maneuver creates two separate heating cycles. The material spikes in temperature, cools briefly, then heats up a second time. During that cooling phase, gases trapped inside the ablative material, byproducts generated by the charring process, found themselves under rapidly shifting pressure conditions. When the second heating cycle began, those trapped gases expanded, and in certain areas, they burst outward through the char layer. They took chunks of material with them. That finding was concerning enough, but what really matters for this 48-hour window you and I are tracking is what NASA decided to do about it. Their decision reveals the massive engineering trade-off that now defines this entire re-entry sequence. We did not redesign the heat shield, we did not replace the AVCOAT with a new material, and we did not rebuild the thermal system from the ground up. Instead, we changed the trajectory. Artemis II will not skip. It will be a direct entry, a single continuous plunge into the atmosphere without the maneuver that caused the thermal problems on Artemis I. One heating event, one monotonic rise in temperature, with no cooling gap. No pressure reversal, no trapped gas expansion cycle. On paper, that sounds like a clean solution. Just remove the condition that caused the failure. Problem solved. But wait, the engineering logic here is actually more complicated than it appears to be on the surface. This connects directly to why this 48-hour window carries so much uncertainty. You see, they didn't actually fix the material itself. They changed the thermal history the material will endure. That is a fundamentally different approach to solving a hardware problem. The AVCOAT chemistry is identical, as is the manufacturing process and the bond to the capsule internal structure. The critical difference is the heat profile it faces during re-entry. Instead of two pulses with a gap, it takes one sustained continuous thermal load. So the question isn't whether the skip trajectory will trap gas again. We've moved past that specific concern. The real question is how this exact material behaves under a continuous, high-energy thermal profile it has never actually experienced during a real space mission. They didn't skip the redesign out of negligence, it is schedule physics. Swapping a thermal protection system on a crewed spacecraft isn't just a parts change. AVCOAT blocks are individually fitted to the capsule curved surface. Every single block is hand-packed, bonded, and painstakingly inspected and verified. A material redesign requires requalifying every step of manufacturing and retesting everything from components to the full integrated system. Then we have to repeat the entire integration process. That is years of work. Years the Artemis program didn't have for its launch window. So the decision was made. Keep the shield, change the trajectory, validate the new profile through ground testing, and accept the remaining uncertainty. This is where the 48-hour convergence thread pulls tight. The heat shield is the last physical barrier between the crew and the atmosphere. Every other system and every trajectory correction is upstream of the moment when plasma closes around the capsule and the avcoat is forced to perform. That performance is being extrapolated from our modelling and ArcJet ground tests, not from a prior crewed flight through this exact thermal environment. Let me be precise here. Apollo used smaller capsules at lower speeds with an entirely different chemical ablator. Artemis I flew an avcoat on a skip entry trajectory. However, Artemis II is flying that same material on a direct entry at lunar return velocities with people inside. For the first time, we have no flight data that matches this specific configuration. The simulations say it will work, but that is only math. Ground tests suggest the material can survive the thermal load, but simulations depend on models, and models depend entirely on assumptions. Assumptions are governed by what we have observed before. When you fly a new configuration for the first time, you are testing those assumptions with lives. The real engineering debate, the one that isn't mentioned in press conferences, isn't actually about whether the shield will fail. No credible engineer predicts failure. The debate is about failure morphology. If something happens, what physical shape does that failure actually take? Where does it start? How does it spread? These are questions simulations can narrow down, but they can't answer them definitively. This is because real thermal environments involve variables no ground facility can replicate, like the precise plasma composition at Mach 32. We're talking shock layer turbulence, the interaction of ablation products with ionized air, and the structural vibrations transmitted directly into the heat shield surface. These are the dangerous unknowns hiding in the gap between analytical paperwork and real-world operational validation. The Orion astronauts are trusting a system that has been analytically cleared, but never operationally proven in this exact high-stakes configuration. That is not unusual in our line of work. Every first flight of a new system has that gap. But it means the shield isn't solved. It is a massive variable in this 48-hour window. Its behaviour during peak heating determines whether this mission becomes a tragedy. If you are starting to feel like this re-entry is stacking too many unknowns, you need to hold that thought for a moment. There is another variable arriving at the exact same time, one that has nothing to do with the spacecraft itself, and everything to do with space weather. Now for the silent wildcard, solar geometry. There is a geomagnetic storm currently forecast for the day of splashdown. This isn't a dramatic storm that threatens power grids. It is a G1 storm, which is the absolute lowest classification on the official NOAA scale. If you only looked at that classification, you would dismiss it as minor background noise, something hardly worth our concern. But classification only tells you magnitude. It doesn't tell you timing. And timing is everything inside this critical 48-hour window. This storm stems from a coronal hole stream hitting what we call a corrotating interaction region out in the solar wind. This is the boundary zone where fast solar wind from the coronal hole catches the slower wind, compressing it into a high-pressure front. When that front hits Earth's magnetosphere, it distorts the magnetic field and drives electrical currents through our ionosphere. The KP index is forecast to hit 5. By standard space weather metrics, that is still considered a minor event. But those effects ripple down into the systems that the Artemis II recovery operation depends on. They matter to us. AKP-5 disturbance delays GPS signals. We aren't talking massive lags, but meters of positional uncertainty. But recovering a capsule from the open Pacific at night? That is an operation that lives and dies on precision. The Navy recovery team, the helicopters, and the divers who enter the water all depend on us knowing exactly where that capsule is at splashdown. GPS is the backbone of that tracking chain. When the ionosphere is disturbed, accuracy degrades in ways that are probabilistic and not uniform. Our error bars are expanding. We're losing precision in the positioning data at the worst possible moment. High-frequency radio, our critical backup for coordination between recovery assets, is degrading under these geomagnetic storm conditions. HF radio depends entirely on ionospheric reflection. When the ionosphere is warped by solar wind pressure, those vital reflection paths become unreliable. Comms are patchy, signals fade. Coordination becomes a nightmare right when we need it most. And we are doing all of this in the dark. Since splashdown happens at night, we're blind visually. We have to rely on radar, infrared, and beacon signals to track those parachutes. Every tracking method has an error margin, and those margins are growing because the electromagnetic environment is completely unstable. The overlap of GPS drift, radio failure, and night blindness doesn't give us one clean failure to solve. We get a smeared, uncertain tracking picture. Our confidence in the capsule's location is drifting just as the recovery teams need it most. This 48-hour convergence isn't just about the spacecraft's health. It's about whether Earth's system's functioning perfectly at the exact moment the crew needs us most. Reentry is our irreversible commitment. The recovery is the irreversible consequence we must live with. A G1 storm, considered minor by our standards, is introducing a dangerous wobble into this final chain of events. The heat shield is facing its first real test while radiation peaks, but realistically, we aren't going to scrub a recovery for a minor G1 storm. We won't delay splashdown just because the KP index hit 5, but we must realise that our safety margins are being nibbled away from every direction simultaneously. This makes the next phase absolutely critical. The trajectory is starting to lock in, leaving us with zero room for error. Once it locks, every one of these variables becomes irreversible. Part 4. Trajectory correction burns as precision traps. We've planned 3 trajectory correction burns to define the final return corridor for Artemis II. View them as the final 3 turns of a combination lock. Each click brings the capsule closer to its required entry angle. Every burn removes a degree of freedom we held previously. We have already successfully executed the first of these 3 maneuvers. A minor delta-V adjustment, small in thrust but massive in consequence. It began the process of shrinking our wide return corridor into a dangerously narrow one. You and I need to understand that entry angle is absolute. It isn't a suggestion, it's a law of physics. Orion must hit the upper atmosphere at a precise angle relative to the local horizon. There is an acceptable range, but it's punishingly small for our navigators. Come in too shallow, and the capsule skips off the atmosphere like a stone on a pond. We don't get a re-entry. It will sail back into deep space on a path we can't fix, because the service module has already been jettisoned. Too steep, and the thermal load destroys the heat shield. The capsule overheats and the structure fails. Outside that corridor, there is no middle ground. This is a physics tunnel with lethal walls. Every correction burn makes that tunnel physically narrower while increasing our targeting precision in space. The first burn aimed us at a general region. The second burn will target a very specific slice of the atmosphere. The third burn locks the angle and velocity. After that, no amount of adjustment from our end can change the outcome. After the third burn, the capsule is on a ballistic trajectory. We're aiming at an atmospheric keyhole that is metaphorically the width of a door frame at the end of a 240,000-mile hallway. Here is the brutal trade-off that makes this 48-hour window so tense. Every burn that increases our targeting precision simultaneously strips away our backup recovery options. Before that first burn, the corridor was wide enough that we had multiple entry solutions on the table. We could have adjusted for a different landing zone or different timing if we detected a problem, but after that final burn, every one of those options simply collapses. We've aimed the capsule. Physics takes over now. Entry will happen exactly where those burns dictated. Once those burns are executed, nothing the crew or ground control does can meaningfully change the mission outcome. This is what I call the precision trap. The same process ensuring we hit the target is the same one that kills every alternative if conditions change on us. If the storm intensifies beyond our forecast, we're already locked in. If the heat shield telemetry shows an anomaly, we're still locked in. Even if the recovery fleet loses tracking capability, our trajectory is already locked. The burns keeping this crew alive by securing a survivable entry angle are the exact same burns erasing every possible escape route. We depend on real-time tracking to calculate every single burn. That data flows through the deep space network into our complex orbit determination models. We translate that into burn parameters. The entire chain demands absolute precision. As the capsule nears Earth, our tracking geometry shifts significantly for us. Latency drops, which sounds helpful, but our margin for correction shrinks too. The burn must be more precise because flight time is running out. We have less distance downstream to compensate for errors. Every single parameter is tightening on us simultaneously. There's no aborting back to lunar orbit once we finalize these burns. The crew module lacks an engine capable of reversing this trajectory. We don't have a scenario where we can just go around and try again. These burns commit the crew to re-entry. Re-entry commits the crew to the heat shield. The heat shield commits them to the parachutes. The parachutes commit them to the recovery fleet. This is a chain of irreversible commitments. Each burn makes the next link mandatory. Our engineering philosophy here is simple. We must converge. We cannot improvise. Trajectory management leaves zero room for creativity. I calculate, I verify, and then I have to trust the math. My crew understands this. Once that final burn is completed, they are simply passengers to the laws of physics. Training and judgment matter for the systems they control, but this trajectory? That belongs to orbital mechanics now. And physics does not negotiate. That narrowing funnel, that precision trap, is the backbone of our 48-hour convergence window. Radiation, heat shield flaws, geomagnetic storms, and dark recoveries. They all collide inside this one tightening corridor. This corridor tightens with every burn. Now we must see if they can actually fly this craft by hand. If automation fails during re-entry, I have to wonder, can a human do what the computer was built for? Phase 5. Manual piloting tests. Validating control versus autonomy. You and I are watching as the Artemis II crew conducts a test that sounds routine, but is critical for re-entry. They're flying the Orion capsule manually, hands on controllers, eyes on data, and thrusters fired by human command. We use two modes. First is 6 degrees of freedom, total authority over every axis of movement and rotation. The crew forces the craft to pivot and slide using the reaction control thrusters. The second mode is simplified 3 degrees of freedom, where we limit inputs and the craft responds with more constraint. We're measuring more than success. We are analysing the feel and how this vehicle reacts to human touch. We are checking for lag. Handling changes once you leave the simulator and enter the reality of deep space flight. Ordinarily, the guidance computer handles everything. Trajectory, attitude, and orientation are usually all automated. Machines have a precision we just cannot match. But autonomy is only helpful if the systems actually stay alive. What if the computer glitched? What if the sensors lost lock or the measurement units drifted too far? Someone has to take the stick and guide us through that narrow entry corridor with perfect accuracy. Those trajectory correction burns already defined the boundaries. The gap between survival and thermal overload is mere fractions of a degree. Imagine holding that margin manually while atmospheric forces hit the capsule at Mach 32. We're hunting for something subtle, the drift between human intuition and the logic of our automated systems. Simulators provide a model of what to expect, but models are always built on assumptions. In reality, thrusters fire differently. The spacecraft momentum might not match our ground-based equations. Mass models can be off. Fluid sloshing in the tanks creates dynamics our simulators could only guess at. We could not replicate everything perfectly. Small differences stack up to create a very unique, very dangerous handling profile. The crew is feeling this for the first time. Honestly, there is a deeper engineering worry behind this test. It is not just system checks. We need consistency, and frankly, every pilot has their own style. Reaction times and strategies vary. My job is to ensure the control system is robust enough for anyone. Every single crew member must stay within tolerance. It should not matter who is in the pilot's seat. We treat human variability as a design parameter. The system has to tolerate different styles of flying. The response cannot diverge. This leads us directly into that critical 48-hour convergence window. If automation fails during re-entry, the crew is our only backup. They have to hold that attitude manually. We're validating that backup plan right now, while the craft is being bathed in high-energy electrons. We are testing a heat shield that has never seen humans. These manual tests are not just a side note. They are the backbone of our strategy. We are proving the crew can be the redundancy if automation stutters. This is the mission's most vital phase. There is a psychological weight here that every astronaut understands. We call them loss of trust moments, that terrifying instant when a pilot realizes the automation isn't doing its job. You have to react faster than you can think. There is no pause button when you are hitting the atmosphere. You either trust the machine or you grab the stick. You cannot hesitate, and you cannot overcorrect. That is the point of these tests, practicing that mental switch from being a passenger to being the pilot. Inside this 48-hour window, radiation is actively threatening our hardware. The switch is more vital than ever. It messes with sensors, screens, and even the thrusters the pilot is trying to command. If electron charging has degraded performance, this test might not even prepare them for the actual re-entry. Convergence isn't just luck, it is the friction between every system we have tested and a moment we haven't. I need to refocus our attention on the radiation environment. We have analysed trajectory burns and manual tests, but that electron storm is still raging. It has been relentless. The way it degrades a spacecraft isn't the cinematic explosion people expect. It is much more subtle. It is a slower, quieter decay, impossible to detect until the point of no return. Part 6. Radiation as a slow system stressor. That 2 mega-electron volt flux simply refuses to subside. As our crew readies for the final return phase, this hostile particle environment continues pumping raw energy into the ship's metallic skeleton. I need to divide this into 2 distinct categories. Public discourse often lumps them together, but that confusion masks the lethal risks of this 48-hour window. The first category is the biological radiation dose to the crew. This is the classic scenario people imagine when they hear the term radiation in space. High-energy particles piercing the body, shredding DNA, and raising long-term cancer risks. Fortunately, for this mission, the proton flux is low. That provides some stability. Our crew is not currently facing a lethal, acute biological dose. We are still calculating their cumulative dose, but there is no immediate health threat to the astronauts from particle strikes. That is the good news. The second category is what worries me during this convergence window. It is not biological, it is purely electrical. Sustained electron fluxes above 2 mega-electron volts are not a medical crisis. They are an electrical engineering nightmare. This distinction is vital. The electronics, sensors, and control circuits are the only things keeping these humans alive during the absolute violence of re-entry. Let's walk through the physics once more. It connects directly to the moment this capsule slams into the atmosphere. High-energy electrons punch through the outer hull, embedding themselves deep within the internal dielectric materials. Over days, that trapped charge accumulates. The voltage across the insulating layers begins to climb. It creates a state of invisible electrical stress. The insulation is saturated, holding a massive charge, just waiting for a trigger to spark. A sudden heat spike, a sharp vibration, or even cooling contraction. Any minor shift in that dielectric geometry can trigger a sudden, catastrophic discharge. And what is re-entry, if not the most violent perturbation a spacecraft will ever have to survive? Exterior temperatures soar by thousands of degrees. Vibrations scream as the capsule fights the atmosphere. Structural loads begin to shift. Every single trigger for a dielectric discharge hits simultaneously, during the exact phase of flight where system reliability is our only lifeline. I keep returning to this analogy. Imagine you have been inflating a rubber balloon, very slowly, for 5 days. Every breath adds a tiny bit of pressure. The balloon looks perfect. You could hold it and never realize it is at its limit. Then, someone slaps it. That slap is re-entry, and whether it pops depends entirely on the invisible pressure built up over those 5 long days. The secondary radiation, that Bremsstrahlung effect I mentioned, adds another dangerous layer to the situation. The ship's own shielding has been bleeding out secondary X-rays as a byproduct of stopping those high-speed electrons. After 5 days of sustained exposure, the internal radiation field is now measurably higher than what we would see in a clean environment. This field does not shatter components like a direct particle strike, but it steadily raises what we engineers call the noise floor. It is the baseline level of interference that every sensor and circuit must fight through just to function correctly. An elevated noise floor means significantly weaker signal ratios and muddied data from critical instruments like our star trackers and accelerometers. This compromises the very instruments our guidance computer needs to manage entry. Again, I am not predicting a total failure yet. The quiet question haunting the engineering team is how much of our safety margin has been eaten by 5 days of bombardment. Because safety margins are not infinite, they are strictly budgeted. Every bit of noise that drains that budget pushes the systems closer to the razor-thin line between reliability and total anomaly. This is the radiation factor in our 48-hour convergence. The trajectory burns have already locked our crew into a final, irreversible entry. Our manual piloting tests established handling baselines, but those conditions might shift under the extreme loads of re-entry. Meanwhile, the radiation environment has been silently degrading the very electronics meant to manage the most critical 5 minutes of this entire mission. All 3 threads converge on a single moment: atmospheric entry at Mach 32, where raw physics finally takes absolute control. The ship stops being an engineering system and becomes a thermodynamic event. It starts with a wall of plasma and a total loss of communication. I want to show you exactly what that looks like inside the capsule. Part 7. Mach 32 as a physics boundary. When Orion reaches the entry interface at 400,000 feet, the spacecraft is screaming along at roughly 25,000 miles per hour. That is relative to the Earth. In atmospheric terms, you and I are looking at approximately Mach 32. But forget what you think you know about Mach 32. The number alone cannot capture the violence being done to the vehicle. At velocities most people understand, air flows around an object. At supersonic speeds, it compresses into shock waves. But at Mach 32, the air transforms. We see the kinetic energy peak as the capsule slams into the upper atmosphere, forcing air molecules ahead of us to literally tear apart. They shatter into individual atoms. Then those atoms ionize, and electrons are violently stripped away from their nuclei. This gas becomes plasma, a superheated sea of charged particles radiating intense energy across the entire visible and infrared spectrum. The capsule is no longer flying through air. We have created a sheath of ionized gas simply by moving at these impossible speeds. And that plasma shell does something that fundamentally changes our risk calculus for the next 5 minutes. It blocks all electromagnetic signals. Radio waves simply cannot penetrate that ionized wall surrounding the vehicle. Ground communication ceases, telemetry stops, voice contact stops. All tracking data just vanishes. For 5 long minutes, the Orion and its 4 crew members are completely severed from humanity. Not a single controller can see them. No engineer can diagnose a fault. No command can be sent. We are essentially a sealed thermodynamic system, falling through fire with 0 external input. During this blackout, The reaction control thrusters maintain our attitude passively, keeping the heat shield pointed into the plasma, based on guidance math calculated before the silence began. If our calculations were correct, and the entry angle was precise, the capsule will weather the heat pulse and emerge with a functional shield. If something fails during the blackout, there is no way to talk, and no way for us to help them. Depending on the failure, there might be no mechanism for recovery at all. Let's anchor this in our 48-hour framework. Reentry is not just a high-risk phase, it's the irreversible climax of the mission. Every factor from the last 2 days, the electron storms, the heat shield concerns, the trajectory burns, it all comes down to this. The burns locking the corridor and the storms affecting recovery have all been building toward this 5-minute window where engineering either holds or breaks. No human intervention is possible now, and honestly, the physics of this heating process are widely misunderstood. Most people would tell you the capsule heats up because of atmospheric friction, but they would be wrong. At Mach 32, the primary killer is compression, not friction. The air simply cannot get out of our way. It crushes violently against the heat shield, instantly converting that kinetic energy into raw thermal power. The shock layer hits thousands of degrees because we are crushing the air into a state where thermal radiation becomes the primary way energy is transferred. This isn't a friction burn. This is compression plasma radiation at point-blank range inside the capsule. Inside, the crew feels the weight of deceleration as the atmosphere breaks them from 25,000 miles per hour to subsonic speeds. The forces are survivable, and they have trained for this, but the pressure is sustained and incredibly intense. The vibrations are brutal, structural loads are at their limit, and just outside, the plasma is hot enough to melt steel in seconds. Apollo went through this, but the Artemis scale is different in ways that should concern us. The Orion capsule is larger than the Apollo modules, meaning a much bigger frontal area is fighting the atmosphere. That translates to a different thermal load across the shield and far more complex flow patterns in the shock layer. Edge effects around the perimeter are more pronounced, creating dangerous thermal gradients between the shield and the back shell. We can analyze the data, but it means the Apollo missions are only an analog, not a perfect template. Eventually, we will emerge at a lower velocity, dropping below the ionization threshold. Communication will suddenly flicker back to life. At that moment, you and I, and ground control, will finally learn if the heat shield actually held together. We will see if the electronics survived the plasma and if our guidance kept us on the right path throughout the heat. Everything that happened during that blackout will only be known once it is over. It depends entirely on how the shield behaved under conditions it has never seen. This isn't just a theory. This is a material science reality happening right now, with a human crew on board. Section 8. How the heat shield behaves under unknown thermal sequencing. The plasma hitting Orion reaches 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, our Avcoat material does exactly what we designed it for. It sacrifices itself. The surface chars to absorb energy, then erodes to carry the heat away from the crew. The ablation front moves inward through the material, creating a thermal gradient that keeps the inner structure survivable. In principle, we understand this process perfectly. We have tested it in ArcJet facilities, using high-energy plasma torches to simulate these brutal re-entry conditions. We saw it during Artemis I, though the unexpected cracking and shedding is exactly why we changed the trajectory for this mission. The core physics of ablation are not the mystery here. The open question is how that mechanism performs across a full 5-meter shield under continuous heating at lunar return velocities. That specific test has never been run on Earth or in flight. Right now, as we speak, this crew is out there flying the mission. Our direct entry profile cuts the thermal cycling risks we saw on Artemis I. It is a win for safety, sure, but it creates an entirely new thermal history. Gone are the 2 heat pulses in that cooling gap. Instead, our shield endures one relentless, sustained thermal event. The heat climbs, peaks and fades as we slow down. no cooling pause, no pressure reversal, just a constant furnace. The thermal gradient across the avcoat is monotonic. It climbs toward the surface, relentlessly pushing that ablation front deep inside. Simpler maybe, but when you apply heat at this scale continuously, you start dealing with dangerous new unknown. The way heat spreads across every square inch of that 5-meter shield depends entirely on the plasma flow pattern in the shock layer. That plasma flow depends on the capsule's precise attitude, its exact velocity, the air density at every altitude, and the geometry of the shield itself, a surface that is constantly eroding. It is a coupled problem. The heat warps the surface, and that warped surface changes how the heat hits it. Modelling that complex interaction across the entire shield, including every variation in thickness and bond quality, pushes our fluid dynamics simulations to their limit. Ground tests help, but no facility on Earth can replicate a real lunar return. We use arc jets on small samples, but that is just a preview. These tests validate the charring and the chemistry, but we are only testing small patches, not the entire integrated system. They cannot reproduce the full surface flow interaction, the structural vibrations hitting the shield, or the pressure distribution across that curved surface at hypersonic velocity. We still do not fully know how melting material from one area interacts with the plasma flow over the rest. This is not about the probability of failure. You and I need to understand that we do not just assign a 2% risk factor. We treat it as an unknown failure morphology problem. If the shield hits a condition beyond its design limits, despite all our testing, where does the failure actually begin? Does a localized hotspot bloom where the plasma flow shifts unexpectedly? Does erosion proceed unevenly, creating a geometry that further concentrates the heat? Will the bond between the avcoat and the frame weaken, creating a gap that exposes the aluminium structure underneath to the fire? These are not failure modes we predicted. They are the scenarios lurking in the gap between what we simulated and what we experienced in flight. This connects to the convergence window in the most direct way possible. That shield is the final barrier between the crew and the plasma environment. If our models are right, the capsule survives re-entry with safety margins to spare. If the shield deviates from our models in any significant way, that deviation determines the outcome, and the crew cannot respond during the plasma blackout. Heat shield performance is binary in outcome, but the uncertainty is a spectrum. It either works, or it reveals a failure mode no one predicted. We will only know the truth once those 5 minutes of blackout end. There is one more piece of this puzzle we need to lock in before we can move forward. And it is the specific piece that makes this entire heat shield debate much harder than it should be. There is an assumption in public and technical circles that because Apollo did this 50 years ago, the problem is solved. I'm here to tell you that assumption is wrong. Understanding why it is wrong is critical to seeing where this crew stands in the convergence window. Part 9. Why the Apollo comparisons fail. Comparing Artemis II to Apollo is a natural instinct. Both return from the moon. Both rely on capsule re-entry. Both use ablative shields. Apollo did it 9 times between 1968 and 1972. Every single astronaut came home alive. That history feels like a solid foundation. It feels like definitive proof that we have mastered this technology. In a sense, it is. Apollo proved the basic concept of using ablative thermal protection for high-speed atmospheric re-entry. But the Orion capsule is not an Apollo module. It is not just a larger version of one. It is a structurally and thermodynamically unique vehicle, entering the atmosphere under very different conditions. The differences aren't cosmetic. They go right down to the load-bearing structures. The Apollo module was just under 13 feet wide. Orion is over 16 feet. You and I need to understand that 3-foot increase does not scale linearly in its physics. A bigger area means a larger stagnation region where the plasma compresses with terrifying intensity. It completely changes the shock layer geometry. The shock detachment angles, the way the plasma wraps around the shield shoulder, and the turbulence in the wake, it all changes non-linearly as the capsule diameter grows. Data for a 13-foot capsule doesn't just work for 16 feet. More importantly, the actual heat shield chemistry is different. Apollo used an epoxy Novolac resin system. Avcoat, our material, uses an entirely different chemical formulation. Both are ablators, yes, but their charring behavior and thermal conductivity at high temperatures are unique to each material. The mechanical response and the interaction with the plasma are material specific. You cannot simply transfer that data from one formulation to the other. We must establish the Avcoat performance envelope independently of anything we learned from Apollo. Apollo informs our approach, but it doesn't validate our hardware. And then there is the entry velocity. Artemis II returns from the Moon at velocities in the upper range of Apollo speeds, and the Orion capsule is significantly heavier than the Apollo command module. More mass at the same velocity means much more kinetic energy to absorb. The thermal load budget is fundamentally different. My data shows the deceleration profile is shifting. The time spent in that peak heating regime is completely different. Scale effects complicate these variables in ways ground testing can't fully capture. Large surfaces propagate structural stress differently. Uniform ablation across a 5-meter shield is a far steeper engineering climb than on a 3.9-meter shield. The thermal expansion mismatch between Avcoat and the frame scales with area. More surface means more total displacement. We are facing a dangerous engineering fallacy here. The assumption that historical heritage somehow equals modern validation. Just because Avcoat has Avcoat roots doesn't make this shield flight proven. The chemical material itself is different. The capsule is different. The trajectory is different. The scale is different. We analysed every variable, but models aren't reality. But the integrated system, the full capsule hitting lunar return speeds on a direct entry, has never carried a human soul. That final integration test happens in real time during a 48-hour window. Apollo's legacy can't substitute for it. I am not predicting a failure. Our analysis is deep, and the ground testing has been incredibly rigorous. Our teams are the world's best, but certainty simply doesn't exist. The crew is entering a regime that defies historical data. Whatever we see during those 5 minutes of plasma blackout will be brand new data, not a confirmation of the past. And once they punch through that blackout, once the heat shield is either held firm or failed, the mission transforms into an Earth problem. The capsule will slam into the Pacific at night during a geomagnetic storm. Retrieving that crew alive depends on a logistical chain that carries its own set of terrifying vulnerabilities. Let's look at the recovery architecture. That G1 geomagnetic storm I mentioned earlier is not just a background detail. It isn't some minor footnote in the logs. It's not a yellow advisory we can just file away and ignore. It is a measurable, real-time condition. You and I need to see how a minor storm could unravel the final phase. Recovery isn't as simple as spotting a capsule and grabbing the crew. It's far more complex than most people realise. It is not simple at all. Stick with me while I explain what the ionosphere is actually doing during a storm. The trouble starts miles above the fleet, in a layer of the atmosphere that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The ionosphere sits 60 to 600 miles up. Solar radiation strips electrons from gas, creating a shell of charged particles. Under normal conditions, this region is stable. We have reliable models to account for its behaviour. GPS signals pass through this shell, picking up a slight delay as they interact with those charged particles. Your phone, your car navigation, the receivers on a Navy destroyer, they all rely on the same signal processing. They correct for that delay using atmospheric models. We predict exactly how much the ionosphere will slow the signal. The math works. Under standard conditions, the resulting positional accuracy is good enough to place you within a few meters. But during a G1 storm, the predictability vanishes. Solar wind distorts the magnetic field, driving currents through the ionosphere. This redistributes particle density in ways our standard correction models were never designed to process. The atmosphere becomes patchy. Some regions get denser, creating longer delays that our instruments can't account for. Other areas thin out. The gradients between these dense and thin zones can shift in mere minutes. Our GPS models assume a smooth ionosphere. When it gets turbulent, the corrections stop matching the actual physical conditions. We're talking about meters of error, maybe tens of meters. On land, with visual cues, you would never even notice. But Artemis II will be bobbing in the Pacific at night. Out there are no landmarks or visual references. Nothing exists to help a helicopter pilot manually correct for what the instruments are getting slightly wrong. The GPS coordinates for the recovery fleet will have much wider error bars than on a magnetically quiet day. And those wider error margins translate directly into a slower search and rescue operation. Think of it this way. Usually, tracking data points to a spot the size of a single parking space. During a storm, that search area expands to the size of a football field, maybe even larger. The difference between a parking space and a football field at night, in heavy swells, is measured in critical minutes. Minutes the crew spends trapped in a bobbing capsule, potentially breathing in toxic heat shield fumes in a hazardous environment. That vehicle was designed to survive re-entry, not to be a comfortable waiting room in the open ocean. In a daytime recovery, we have eyes on the target. Helicopters and ships can visually confirm the physical location. But at night, that visual safety net vanishes. We're forced to rely entirely on sensors and signatures. Finding them depends on radar, infrared signatures, and a lone electronic beacon. We have to hope they all hold up. Every system provides its own tracking data, and our recovery team assembles a composite picture from all of them. GPS is the spine of that data. It is our most precise input, the anchor point for every other sensor. When GPS degrades, the composite image loses its anchor. Radar still flows in, but it is tied to an uncertain coordinate. The infrared track remains valid, but remember, the helicopter carrying that sensor navigated to its search station using wobbly GPS. Every link in our tracking chain is downstream of satellite positioning. When that wobbles, the entire mission wobbles with it. Then we add high-frequency radio to the mix. The recovery fleet does not operate in silence. It is loud. Ships talk to helicopters. Helicopters talk to the command vessel. The command vessel talks back to us at mission control. Divers in the water relay vitals to the helicopter overhead. This coordination network relies on high-frequency radio to bridge horizons. HF radio works by bouncing signals off the ionosphere, sending them up to reflect off charged particles and back to a receiver. It is elegant but fragile. When a geomagnetic storm hits that ionosphere, the very air we use starts to distort. Those reflection paths turn unpredictable. A signal hits a patch of ionosphere that has shifted, bouncing away at an unintended angle. It arrives garbled, weak, or simply vanishes. Our operators hear static where a status update should have been. The crew calls for confirmation and hears only silence. What should be crisp and sequential becomes halting and uncertain. This is happening precisely when coordination is most critical. Our crew has just survived an atmospheric re-entry at Mach 32. The heat shield held, the plasma blackout faded, parachutes deployed. The capsule hit the water. The irreversible physics are over. It worked. They are alive. But the final link, the one that turns survival into rescue, is operating under degraded conditions. All because a burst of solar wind hit our magnetic field at the worst possible moment. Re-entry was the commitment. Recovery is the consequence. And it is playing out in an environment that is measurably, demonstrably failing us today. You and I need to internalize why this specific 48-hour window makes this storm so dangerous to us. On any other day, a G1 geomagnetic storm is a non-event. Our fleets have navigated through far worse conditions before. GPS has glitched before. Radio has failed before. In isolation, we have a manual for every single one of these workarounds. No scientist is going to lose sleep over a G1 storm in a vacuum, but this storm is not isolated. It is hitting a capsule whose heat shield just survived its first crude test, with avionics soaked in radiation for 5 days. The trajectory is locked. The splashdown is at night. We are looking at a sequential chain where every step must work before the next one can begin. The G1 storm is not the danger itself. It is just the final layer in a stack of conditions. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. There are no alarms, no red lights on a console. It simply nibbles at our margins, widening our error bars and delaying us. It blurs the tracking images that need to be perfect. When every system is already pushed to its limit, those margins are not surplus. They were the only margins this mission was counting on. You and I must understand that this window is about margins. The space between this definitely works and this should work. It is the gap between what we designed and what we actually tested. The distance between our models and reality. Every factor here is eating our margins. Radiation took some, heat shield doubt took some, trajectory lock took even more. Night recovery took even more. Now the storm is quietly consuming the last of our reserves at the worst possible time. No official source will call a G1 storm dangerous. It is not until it becomes the final straw on a 2-day stack. Part 11. Recovery Chain Fragility. Let me walk you through exactly what happens after we hit the water. The public sees a celebration, but they ignore a complex, multi-step sequence that is absolutely intolerant of even a single failure. You have seen the footage. A bobbing capsule, helicopters circling, divers jumping in, then astronauts smiling on a deck wrapped in towels. It looks routine. It looks like the hard work is finally finished. The reality is far more fragile. Within this convergence window we are tracking, that fragility carries a heavy weight today. The capsule hits the water. From an engineering standpoint, let me unpack what that violent event actually means for us. Our Orion spacecraft, descending under its 3 massive main parachutes, we impact the ocean at a velocity that is survivable but violent. We have slowed the vehicle from hypersonic to 20 miles per hour. That sounds gentle until you realize a multi-ton spacecraft is hitting an incompressible fluid. It is an impact cushioned by physics. The landing attitude allows the base heat shield to absorb that contact, distributing those forces across the widest possible surface area. Our crew is in shock-attenuating seats, but make no mistake, this is a significant, violent impact event. Spines compress, bones vibrate. After surviving re-entry, our equipment suddenly absorbs a massive secondary shock from a completely different vector. We watch the telemetry as the capsule slams from 20 miles per hour to 0 instantly. It is no longer a ballistic projectile. The vehicle must shift from a falling mass under drag to a stable vessel. Believe me, that transition is far from instantaneous. Success is not guaranteed on the first try. Gravity can trap the vehicle in what we call a stable 2 orientation. That is just scientific jargon for being upside down. The mass and buoyancy profiles allow for 2 very different floating states. One state leaves the hatch submerged and the heat shield facing the sky. If that happens, we rely on inflation bags. These bags force a roll to right the vehicle. It is a proven system, but it burns precious time. Meanwhile, the crew sits inverted in the dark ocean, suspended by the slow physics of an inflating bag in heavy swells. They wait for buoyancy to win against a stubborn mass distribution. If it works, the capsule finally sits upright on the waves. Imagine their view. The windows are coated in re-entry grime and fog. Inside, the temperature is spiking. Fumes from the scorched heat shield fill the cabin. Charred material has released gases that migrated straight through the structural layers. These vapours seep inside during the descent. We do not expect them to be lethal immediately, but they are incredibly dangerous. Breathing that in a cramped space is a nightmare, especially after the crew has just endured punishing, sustained G-forces. Those forces crushed their spines and drained blood from their brains. Even elite astronauts are left physically broken at this stage. Their bodies have spent days in microgravity. Their cardiovascular and vestibular systems are currently screaming as they try to recalibrate to gravity. They are drained and physiologically compromised in a rocking tomb. Getting them out is not just a goal, it is a medical emergency. It is a race against biology and the environment. We have already pre-positioned the recovery fleet at the splashdown site. We do not chase the capsule. Our ships and helicopters are already waiting in the zone when it hits the water. We station them hours early using mission-controlled trajectory data. Helicopters are already circling, packed with elite rescue divers. These divers are the first contact, but those pilots are flying blind, relying entirely on tracking data over the black ocean. Radar pings the metallic hull. Our infrared sensors lock onto the heat signature of a craft that just braved 5,000 degrees. The craft is still glowing with heat. The beacon pulses a location fix while GPS provides the digital framework for the search. Our tracking architecture fuses these inputs into one composite picture of exactly where that capsule is bobbing. But you and I have to consider the solar storm. Under these conditions, the GPS error bars begin to expand. The tracking solution gets fuzzy. In the dead of night, with no horizon, pilots are flying entirely by their instrument panels. The data is flowing, yes, but it carries a level of uncertainty we would not see on a quiet night in space. That uncertainty means lost minutes. It might not sound like much, but those minutes are everything to the crew inside. This craft is a lifeboat, not a long-term habitat. Divers must deploy immediately to prevent a total physiological breakdown. These are elite Navy specialists who have rehearsed this dozens of times. They leap from the helicopters into the dark Pacific. They swim toward the capsule to begin extraction. Their first priority is securing the massive flotation collar. This ring stabilizes the craft against the violent waves. It is a grueling manual operation done by hand in the water. It is just raw hardware and human muscle fighting the open ocean. And they are doing it in total darkness. The swells are pulling the divers and the capsule in opposite directions. If the sea state turns, everything slows down. Divers have to time their movements to the rhythm of the waves. Meanwhile, radio contact with the helicopter is flickering out. The solar storm is wrecking our radio frequencies. We are losing the real-time coordination that keeps the rescue pilot on target. Without coordination, we lose the spotlights and the status relays. Every broken link in this chain stretches our rescue timeline. These delays are small, but they compound. We cannot even start extraction until the vehicle is fully stabilized. We pop the hatch and pull them out, one by one. It is a slow, agonizingly careful process. We have to evaluate each astronaut's condition before transferring them to a raft. Then comes the slow hoist to safety. This is a rigid, sequential chain. We cannot move the second person until the first is safely hoisted. Extraction cannot start without the collar. The collar cannot be set while the divers are still in the air. And the pilot cannot hover if the GPS data is still a mess of interference. Every single step is a bottleneck. There are no shortcuts here. The hidden risk we face is not just one step failing. It is the cumulative weight of the delay. We have rehearsed every contingency. Our divers have trained for the roughest seas and the darkest nights imaginable. We have practiced for total blackouts and blind instrument approaches. But out here, nature does not care about our simulations. Our recovery ships have protocols for every scenario we can imagine, but we cannot simulate the compound effects of this entire failure chain. Every step is exceeding nominal timelines. Communication is degraded, the tracking data is uncertain, and coordination across our assets is sluggish. It is far slower than a quiet night with clear ionospheric conditions. If command loses clarity with the helicopter, every confirmation window grows longer. If the helicopter cannot relay the diver status with high fidelity, the decision to initiate extraction is dangerously delayed. As the capsule drifts with the currents, our GPS updates arrive with wider uncertainty. The recovery team is forced to sit and wait. We have to reacquire tracking confidence before putting swimmers in the water. These delays are small, but this chain has 12 steps. If every step eats 2 or 3 minutes of coordination latency, the total timeline for extraction expands by over half an hour. 30 minutes with 4 astronauts sealed in a capsule, breathing residual fumes while riding Pacific swells in total darkness. Our 48-hour convergence thread is becoming terrifyingly clear. The crew survived radiation that had been hammering their avionics for 5 full days. They survived a heat shield test we had never performed with a human crew in this specific configuration. They survived the plasma blackout where they were alone and unreachable. They survived the parachute deployment, that final gate before impact. Now, in the mission's closing minutes, the final dependency chain between survival and rescue is operating under measurably degraded conditions. This is caused by a geomagnetic storm that no official agency would label dangerous. That is the true nature of convergence risk. You do not need a catastrophic failure for a tragedy. You do not need an explosion or a total structural collapse. It only requires margin erosion at enough sequential steps to push the cumulative timeline past the threshold we designed for. Each individual delay is within tolerance, but tolerance is not an infinite resource, it is a budget. Every step in this recovery sequence is now drawing from a budget that has been shrinking for 48 hours. If the parachute system had failed, if those 3 canopies had not blossomed against the sky, the capsule would hit at hundreds of miles per hour. In that scenario, our recovery architecture is meaningless. The ships, helicopters and swimmers all become completely irrelevant. They are useless without the one mechanical system that makes a splashdown survivable in the first place. This brings us to the final system between the crew and the ocean, one that exists entirely outside of electronics, software, or ground control. Fabric and cord are the final word. Parachutes as the last mechanical truth. During every re-entry, there is a moment where we transition from an electronic system to a purely mechanical one. There is no alarm, no indicator light on our consoles, no announcement over the loop. It just happens. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, seconds after the plasma blackout ends, and the heat shield has done its job. Once the capsule drops from hypersonic to subsonic speed, the atmosphere thickens. Now fabric and cord matter more than lines of code. Parachute deployment is the final act of engineering before physics judges whether this crew lives or dies. Everything we have analysed, the solar storm, the heat shield, and the trajectory, all feed directly into this single moment. The geomagnetic disturbance and our degraded tracking all funnel into a chain of events passing through this one gate. If the parachutes work, the chain continues. If they do not, it ends. There is no branching logic, only open or not open. The difference is absolute. It begins with the drogue chutes, and you need to understand their actual function. 2 drogue parachutes deploy while the capsule is still moving at several hundred miles per hour. They are not designed for deceleration. The vehicle is far too heavy and fast for drogues to slow it down. Their primary job is stabilization. As the capsule plows through increasingly thick air at high speeds, it begins to accumulate violent oscillations. It rocks, it swings, and it develops rotational dynamics that could make the entire vehicle tumble out of control. A tumbling capsule cannot safely deploy its main chutes. If they deploy while swinging wildly, the lines will tangle. The canopies can collide, or the loads can distribute asymmetrically, snapping the risers. The drogues are there to prevent that disaster. They impose order on chaos. They take a capsule pitching through turbulent flow and drag it into a stable orientation. They create a predictable environment so the next sequence can proceed. This is what makes us, as engineers, so nervous. Every step only enables the next. The drogues must function perfectly for the main chutes to even have a chance. But the drogues working does not guarantee the mains will follow. Each phase is independent in failure, but dependent in sequence. You cannot skip ahead. You cannot deploy the mains first and hope for the best. The sequence is fixed and must execute without interruption. Once the capsule is stabilized and has reached the correct altitude, the drogue chutes are released. They are cut away, and for a brief moment the vehicle is in free fall again, decelerating only through atmospheric drag. It is a designed gap, intentional and calculated, but a gap nonetheless. A few seconds where the capsule is just a falling object. First we see the pilot chutes deploy. These extraction chutes are tiny, barely larger than what a hobbyist skydiver carries. We designed them for one job, mechanical extraction. They bite into the airstream, inflating to drag 3 massive mains from their housings. Think of them as the hands that reach into the pack and rip the mains into the rushing air. Total mechanical force. Failure here means the main chutes stay locked away while the capsule plummets. Deployment must happen in a precise, staggered sequence. If all 3 canopies snapped open at once, the shock load would literally rip the attachment points right off the Orion hull. So we use reefing lines to hold them partially closed. They open in stages, choking the airflow to manage the tension. Next, programmed reefing cuts allow them to bloom to full diameter. Each step increases the drag, fighting against that terminal velocity. The stress on the risers and the capsule frame is immense, but we have engineered the system to distribute that load proportionally. Each canopy carries 1/3 of the burden. It takes all 3 to slow the Orion down from hundreds of miles per hour. By splashdown, we have bled off enough speed to hit the water at 20 miles per hour. This design is built for redundancy. Inside this narrow re-entry window, this is one of the few places where we have a genuine, battle-tested safety net. We built the craft to survive even if one main fails. If 2 chutes are healthy, they can still compensate for the loss. Should a canopy shred or a line snap, the remaining 2 absorb the extra force. The descent gets faster, the landing harder. The crew will feel that extra G-force, and the frame will groan under the stress. But crucially, they will walk away from it. A few bruises, a dented hull, but survival is the metric. We based our entire philosophy on surviving a single-point failure. Losing 1 chute should not be a death sentence. That redundancy cost us weight and years of grueling laboratory testing. It was a pivotal engineering choice for the Orion program. However, that safety margin has a boundary, and it is incredibly sharp. There is no recovery plan for a dual parachute failure. If 2 of the 3 fail, the situation turns critical for us instantly. One lone canopy cannot generate the drag needed to reach a survivable speed. The capsule will strike the ocean far too fast. The impact forces would shatter the spacecraft hull and exceed the physical limits of what a human body can actually endure. We call this the edge of the design envelope. Beyond this cliff, there is no safety net and no reserve chute. No retro rockets, no airbags, no emergency backup. At this point in the descent, our engineering truly reaches its absolute limit. Either the fabric holds, or the mission ends in a way that no recovery team on Earth can ever hope to fix. I want you to really think about this, because it ties directly into that 48-hour convergence window we have analysed. Our parachute system is different from any other hardware. Once the mortars fire and the drogues release, the sequence is locked. When those pilot chutes drag the mains into the sky, the process becomes purely mechanical. No logic gates and no commands. It is simply fabric, cord and steel. No computer is flying these chutes, and no algorithm can adjust their final shape. We cannot uplink a software patch to fix a torn canopy. No sensor input will ever change how they behave. They are the final deterministic system in the chain, operating on laws of physics that Isaac Newton mastered centuries ago. Drag equals 1/2 times air density times velocity squared times drag coefficient times area. That is the entire governing equation. The math does not care about the previous 5 days. This mechanical independence is our greatest strength and our most sobering reality. Fabric is immune to the electronic noise from 5 days of radiation bombardment. Parachutes do not care about dielectric charging. A sensor reading out of range means nothing here. The system is completely safe from secondary radiation or circuit failures. The geomagnetic storms killing our radios cannot touch these lines. They exist in a domain far removed from the digital world. Radiation has been hammering every other system in this window. But tell me, how do you bit flip a piece of nylon? Stitching does not suffer from signal-to-noise degradation. These chutes are the only system truly isolated from every environmental stressor in space. But that independence is a double-edged sword. If they fail, no electronic rescue or software patch can ever save us. There are no thrusters to slow the fall, and no backup computer to deploy an alternative. We have run out of overrides. We have moved beyond the point where engineers can intervene. Ground control cannot send a command to fix a physical break. The crew cannot flip a switch to save themselves now. They have entered the brutal world of physics and aerodynamic force. In this realm, survival is determined solely by whether the nylon and steel fittings hold up under the massive pressure. The lives of our crew rest on the tensile strength of woven fabric and stitched seams, not our billion-dollar avionics. There is something terrifyingly beautiful about this reduction. We built the most advanced spacecraft, yet it comes down to this. We are returning from the moon with technology Apollo never dreamed of. But in these final minutes, it is all parachutes. This deployment is our final physical safeguard. It is the last gate after those trajectory burns locked the crew into an irreversible corridor. After the heat shield absorbs the plasma and protects our capsule from 5,000-degree heating, after the blackout ends and communication returns, and the world learns the vehicle survived, the parachutes remain the final variable we must observe. They represent the thin boundary between a crewed mission that succeeded at every stage and a scenario that no engineer ever wants to calculate. No administrator wants to brief, and no family wants to envision. Once 3 white canopies bloom against the dark sky, and the descent rate falls, and our tracking stations confirm stable deceleration, the mission finally enters its absolute final phase. Not the triumphant final phase you see on television, but the uncertain one. A capsule bobbing alone in the Pacific Ocean. 4 exhausted crew members inside, waiting. A recovery fleet navigating toward them through degraded signal conditions and dark swells. Divers preparing to jump into black water. A dependency chain with no parallel paths and no shortcuts. The parachutes worked. Now everything that remains depends on whether the margins we have been eroding for 48 hours left enough room. Because the clock is running. It has been running since the electron storm hit us 5 days ago. And it will not stop until 4 pairs of boots are standing on the recovery ship. You and I aren't there yet. Part 13. The stacking model. Why this window is unique. Let us pull every thread we have been following back together. In isolation, each of these factors can be explained away. Every single one. We can say the electron storm flux levels are merely elevated. We can take the heat shield and say our analysis is thorough and ground testing is extensive. We can take the trajectory. We can say the correction burns were executed precisely and the corridor is well within our design tolerance. We can take the geomagnetic storm and say G1 is the lowest class and barely worth a mention. We can take the nighttime recovery and say the fleet is trained and procedures are proven. You would be right about every single one. Not one of these factors exceeds the design limits of the Artemis II mission. Not one of them alone causes a manager to pause. Not one of them would generate a headline or trigger an emergency review. And that is precisely the point. That is the entire point of everything we have been building toward for the last 2 hours. The danger in this window is systemic. It is that every safety margin in every system is being pressed simultaneously. And margins are not infinite concepts. They are physical realities baked into hardware calculated into thermal models, and allocated across every single subsystem. Let's walk through the stack one more time, not to repeat ourselves, but to show you what this stack truly looks like. When you stop examining each factor in isolation and see the interconnected system, you see what they really are right now. They are not separate risks, they are one risk with multiple faces. The electron storm has raged for 5 consecutive days. Not at catastrophic levels that would scrub our mission, but at levels that have been continuously driving charge into the dielectric materials. 5 days of accumulation. 5 days of voltage building across insulation layers only tested for much shorter duration exposures. But these layers were not tested for this exact energy profile. Part of our safety margin has already been consumed. The gap between the normal noise floor of the electronics and a system failure has been reduced. How much? Nobody knows. The instruments to measure internal dielectric charge state do not exist on this vehicle. We do not fly diagnostics on crewed missions. We fly flight hardware, and flight hardware does not report its own erosion. It either works or it does not. This heat shield has never performed a crewed direct entry at lunar return velocity. I must say that again, because weight matters. This specific heat shield, on this trajectory profile, with humans inside the vehicle, has never actually been flown. The analysis says it will hold. Our ground testing says the material can withstand the expected thermal load. Design margins suggest there is sufficient safety factor between the predicted heating and the material's tested limits. The gap between theoretical safety and operational reality remains open. The only way to close it is to fly the mission. The validation and the operation are the same event. The test is the mission, and 4 human lives are our data points. The trajectory has been tightened by sequential burns into a corridor that is surgically precise, but completely inflexible. Each burn refined the entry angle, narrowed the uncertainty, and aimed for that thermal sweet spot in the atmosphere. Each burn also consumed our flexibility. The margin to avoid skipping off the atmosphere is now at its design minimum. The margin to avoid a thermal overload is also at its design minimum. Both margins are still adequate. Both margins are what the mission was designed to operate within, but neither margin has any room for surprises. If the atmosphere is slightly denser than modelled, the heating increases. If the capsule's attitude is off, the angle shifts. The margins should absorb these variations, but they consume margin. Every burn that improved targeting also consumed our flexibility. A geomagnetic storm is forecast to reach G1 levels during splashdown. Not dangerous by standard metrics, but it is measurably present. The ionosphere is becoming disturbed. GPS signal propagation now carries significant uncertainty. HF radio comms will be less reliable than on a magnetically quiet day. The margin for GPS accuracy that the recovery fleet depends on has evaporated. Ship-to-helicopter coordination is getting spotty. It is subtle, but the data is verifiably different. Every link in the recovery chain now takes longer than under clean conditions. We are facing a nighttime ocean recovery where every sequential step is critically dependent. The margin for crew extraction depends on tracking precision, comms, and sea state conditions. It also relies on divers operating in total darkness. Individually, these forecasts look nominal. Weather is a go, but the geomagnetic storm changes the physics of the mission. None of these protocols have the safety buffer they would with rock-solid data. GPS coordinates are drifting by tens of meters instead of 1. See the pattern? You and I have watched this build. No single factor is red yet. Every isolated risk assessment says acceptable, and individually, those results are technically correct. The electron storm, heat shield, trajectory, and night recovery are all officially acceptable. Check, check, check. All green. But are they acceptable when they happen simultaneously? This is a convergence risk model, a concept often underappreciated in complex system safety. The logic is simple. Complex missions rarely fail because of one catastrophic event. Hollywood loves the big explosion, but that is rarely how a mission actually fails. The real path to disaster is quieter. Multiple systems go slightly wrong at once. Each deviation stays within tolerance. Nothing on its own justifies stopping the mission. But the accumulated margin erosion across all systems exceeds our total mission safety budget. This happens not because a system failed, but because the margin budget went bankrupt. We allocate safety margins assuming only one system will be stressed at a time. When they are all stressed, the math changes. It is essentially a bank run. Precision matters when human lives are on the line, so I will be very specific. I am not predicting a failure or suggesting that NASA is being reckless here. A delay is not the point. Flight directors are aware of every factor I am describing. They are monitoring the radiation and geomagnetic storm forecasts while modelling heat shield performance. They have calculated this trajectory with extraordinary, world-class precision. They manage this with the rigour crewed spaceflight demands. These are the best minds alive. I am saying this 48-hour window is unique because of this specific combination. This radiation level is not typical. A first-ever crewed heat shield test is not typical. A geomagnetic storm during a nighttime ocean recovery is definitely not typical. Any one factor is fine. The stack of them inside one irreversible window is unprecedented. You and I must realise that overlapping low-probability events are often underestimated. Our brains are simply wired to assess risks one at a time. If there is a small chance of failure here and there, our intuition feels safe. But compound probability is different. Multiple independent factors active at once drive the risk higher. The interaction effects are multiplicative, not just additive. Worse, interaction creates emergent scenarios that isolated risk assessments can never capture. The radiation assessment did not model a scenario where the heat shield also misbehaves. The heat shield models did not factor in a recovery fleet with degraded communications. Every report was right, but nobody asked the combined question. It is harder to communicate. This is the reality of the convergence window. It is the intersection of every threat. It is where the electron storm, the heat shield, and the nighttime recovery finally meet. Every variable is real. Every factor is present. We are tracking a convergence toward a singular, irreversible entry that will decide this mission. Our crew is trapped in that intersection right now. They have been inside it for days since the electron storm hit. The boundaries of that intersection tighten every hour. With each burn and every minute closer to the entry interface, physics begins to dominate. Our engineering either withstands the strain or it fails. We are about to find out which, very soon. Part 14. The Historical Echo. Apollo 13 versus Artemis II. When we seek a metric for this danger, we look back at Apollo 13. It is the standard analogue, the emergency that defines our collective memory of crewed deep space flight. A lunar mission, a lethal crisis, and a desperate return. Tom Hanks on screen, repeating those famous words about having a problem. The arc of that mission, the ingenuity, the improvised scrubbers, using the lunar module as a lifeboat, it is legendary in our field. That tense re-entry, where no one knew if the shield survived, gives us a framework. It feels like what we are seeing with Artemis II. It feels like the correct lens, the right comparison for us to make. We understand that instinct. Apollo 13 is the primary reference for a crewed moon mission in total jeopardy. However, our technical scrutiny reveals where the comparison fails. Knowing the difference is critical. If you and I examine why the Apollo framework fails here, we reveal the true nature of this crew's challenge. It is something that defies historical narrative. In many ways, it is more unsettling than a simple oxygen tank explosion. Apollo 13 was an internal failure. Let me be specific. On April 13, 1970, an oxygen tank inside the service module exploded. Our investigation traced it to manufacturing defects and testing errors that left wiring compromised inside that tank. When they stirred the tank, those wires sparked. The oxygen ignited, and the resulting pressure blew a panel clean off the spacecraft. The crisis was immediate. It was visible. The crew heard the bang, saw the warnings, and watched the debris and venting gas outside their window. Mission Control saw the telemetry spike. Systems went dark, and within minutes, our colleagues had a working diagnosis. The problem was massive but legible. We could see it, measure it, and isolate the damage from the healthy systems. We could inventory power, water, and oxygen. We knew exactly what remained and how long it would sustain the crew. We engineered solutions in real time, improvising with whatever materials were available on board. The failure was specific enough to define exactly what we needed to bypass. The scrubber hack and the dark coast home were responses to an identified problem. We knew what we were fighting. The risk was high, but the path was visible. This Artemis II convergence is not an internal failure. I need you to understand this distinction. It changes the risk profile entirely. Nothing inside the Orion capsule has actually failed. No tanks exploded, no systems went dark. There are no warning lights or dropping pressure readings on our consoles. The vehicle is nominal, our crew is healthy, trajectory is precise, and the heat shield and avionics are functioning perfectly. All communication links are active. If you check the status board right now, every indicator is green. Every system is operating within its expected range. Internally, this mission is perfect. What is happening is not inside the ship. It is happening to the ship. The environment ahead is stacking conditions that collectively press against the safety margins of every system at once. That electron storm did not break hardware. It has been invisibly stressing the electromagnetic environment inside the vehicle. The heat shield remains intact. But we have never tested it like this with humans aboard. The trajectory is locked into a corridor that is unforgiving. The geomagnetic storm is not disabling systems. It is slowly degrading the tracking our recovery teams rely on. Nothing is broken. The environment is simply squeezing everything at once. This is why the Apollo comparison fails technically. Apollo 13 was a crisis with a diagnosis. Artemis II is not a crisis. It is a condition. Conditions are harder to solve or dramatize than a crisis. A crisis gives us something to fix. A condition is something you endure. A crisis focuses us on a single failure point. A condition spreads risk across all systems. There is no single lever to pull. We cannot just vent a tank to stay safe. We cannot just power down non-essential systems or use duct tape. The condition is the environment itself, and we simply cannot fix the environment. We can only fly through it and hope the margins hold. Solar cycle variability is a factor Apollo never faced like this. We are in solar cycle 25. It has been significantly more active than the models we used when designing this mission. The sustained electron environment and flux levels we have tracked for 5 days are critical metrics. Together, we are watching the geomagnetic forecasts for splashdown and the solar wind during this transit. These are the results of a solar cycle running much hotter than our original predictions allowed. We set a baseline for the Artemis II return based on expected space weather. While current readings fit within our ship's design envelope, they are far more volatile and relentless than our models predicted. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have launched, though. Solar forecasting is based on probability, not certainty. We cannot just wait for a perfectly quiet sun, because the star does not offer us perfect windows on demand. As planners, we account for a solar range and build our craft to handle those specific extremes. But theorizing about a range is one thing. Actually hitting the peak of that range during a mission's most critical phase is quite another. The crew is navigating the real solar environment, not a clean simulation, and reality is more aggressive and chaotic than our data suggested. Modern crewed missions depend on environmental stability far more than the old Apollo era ever did. People forget this in their Apollo nostalgia. Those ships had simple avionics and fewer sensors, making them much more resilient to interference. Those old guidance computers were primitive, running on kilobytes of memory with speeds that a modern digital watch would easily outperform. Yet that simplicity offered a unique resilience. Simple systems are incredibly hard for the environment to disrupt. An old analog circuit ignores a bit of background noise, but a modern digital sensor with hyper-precise calibration, it cares enormously. Orion is generations more capable than anything Apollo carried. Our guidance algorithms are vastly more sophisticated and complex. Our sensor array is comprehensive. The software can execute maneuvers that would have left an Apollo computer completely overwhelmed. But that capability brings sensitivity. Precise sensors have tiny noise tolerances. This means sustained radiation, which raises the electromagnetic background noise, affects them much more severely. Complex algorithms require perfectly clean data. This makes them vulnerable to tiny signal errors caused by charged particles hitting the electronics. Our craft is powerful, but it demands an ideal environment to function correctly. It needs a clean electromagnetic backdrop, a stable signal environment, and a predictable baseline. But this 48-hour window is not providing that. It is far noisier and more variable than anything we planned for. The landscape of risk has shifted fundamentally since Apollo. Apollo's main risks were hardware failure or human error, a stuck valve, a wrong switch sequence, a failed weld or a shorted wire. These are internal risks born inside the system. We can control them through testing, quality assurance, and rigorous training procedures. We can build redundancy to mitigate these issues. If they happen, we can usually diagnose the problem and respond. The entire Apollo emergency architecture assumed that problems always started inside the ship and that human grit would eventually engineer a way out. But the convergence window facing Artemis II is a different kind of risk entirely. It is an environmental synchronization risk. It starts outside our ship. It comes from overlapping external factors that are individually manageable but collectively unprecedented. This electron storm? That is purely a solar phenomenon. The geomagnetic storm is a magnetospheric event. Even the heat shield doubts are just consequences of schedule decisions made years ago. Our trajectory is locked by orbital mechanics. Nighttime recovery is a result of mission timing. None of these are actual malfunctions. Not a single one is an error or a failure of our engineering. They are simply conditions that happen to be present at the same time in this window, pressing on every one of our margins from different directions simultaneously. Apollo 13 showed us what happens when a ship breaks. It showed the heroism of engineers and pilots improvising under impossible pressure. That story is inspiring and well-earned, but it is not the story we are seeing right now. Artemis II is showing us something different. It's what happens when nothing actually breaks, but every system is under pressure. All systems look green, but every margin is paper thin. The spacecraft is nominal, but the universe is not. Our engineering is solid, but the universe isn't cooperating. It's a harder story to tell because there's no villain and no single explosion. There is only this slow, invisible build-up of stress across every system, all converging on an event that is now only hours away. That distinction is vital. It shows why Apollo comparisons, while emotionally powerful, are technically a poor framework for evaluating what our crew is experiencing. They aren't fighting one big failure with grit and duct tape. They aren't improvising a fix for a visible crisis. They are navigating a convergence of environmental forces with no historical parallel in crewed spaceflight, inside a window that closes forever when the capsule hits the atmosphere. We will soon see if those narrow margins hold. In a few hours, we reach the entry interface and physics will take the controls. That moment of atmospheric entry is exactly what you and I have been building towards since this video started. It is the point where every margin we tracked and every concern we named will either hold together or it will fail. There are no partial successes, no mostly worked. It is either through or it is not. Part 15. Final entry. No aborts, no loops, and no second chances. We're nearing the entry interface. Orion is hitting 400,000 feet, where the atmosphere finally begins pushing back against the hull. Every variable now collapses into a single outcome. Those electrons that have been hammering our electronics for days are meeting massive thermal shock. Our heat shield, cleared on paper but never truly tested in this specific configuration, is about to face 5,000 degrees of raw plasma. The trajectory we locked in with those correction burns now meets the air at an angle that's either survivable or it's fatal. That geomagnetic storm has been trashing our recovery fleet's tracking precision, right when we need to find a tiny capsule in a pitch-black ocean. An abort isn't an option anymore. That word implies an alternative path, a way to stop and redirect, but here, no such exit exists. At the entry interface, all escape routes vanish. We've already jettisoned the service module, and the only propulsion we had left. The crew module lacks the engines to reverse speed or alter its path. At this stage, it's just a heavy, ballistic object falling home. We have attitude control to orient the ship, but we can't steer it. We're committed. Falling. And soon, the plasma blackout will cut all comms. For 5 agonizing minutes, ionized gas will envelop the ship, blocking every radio frequency. No voice, no data, and no telemetry. We'll watch the tracking screens go blank and just wait. Inside, the crew will be crushed by deceleration, while the hull screams under the pressure. They'll watch that plasma glow through the ports, forced to trust that our systems will do exactly what they were designed for. The communication loop is dead. There's no way for an engineer like me to look at the data and tell them how to fix a problem. It's a sealed system now, running a pre-programmed sequence in an environment that allows zero margin for mid-course corrections. Once the plasma clears, we enter the parachute chain. The drogues have to fire, followed by the pilot chutes pulling out the mains. 3 main chutes have to inflate to scrub that speed. It's a single chain event. Each step is the only key to the next. You don't get a second try. If the drogues fail, the mains are useless. And if the mains fail, there is no backup system. The ship has transitioned from engineering to pure physics, and physics never negotiates. At its core, splashdown is a brutal binary outcome. Either the capsule hits the water at a survivable speed, or it doesn't. Of course, there's a lot of technical detail in between. We analyse impact loads and orientation, but the truth is simple. The mission either succeeds, or we face a total cascade failure. There's no middle ground for recovery. It only works if the chutes, the heat shield, and the avionics all hold together simultaneously. Even if they're floating, recovery starts in the dark under a trashed ionosphere, where our GPS error bars are wider than we'd like. Radio reliability is dropping, and honestly, this is no longer a spacecraft problem. We've officially handed the mission over to physics. The engineering is locked. Decisions are finished. The burns are done. We just have to hope the shield and chutes perform as designed. The electron storm has already done its damage. This 48-hour window is collapsing into a sequence of events we cannot reverse. This determines the fate of our most ambitious crewed mission in 50 years. We have to remember, 4 people are inside that ship. The crew is ready, and we designed the systems for this. But designed for and operationally proven are 2 very different things. Right now, that gap is closing in real time. There are no more simulations, no more rehearsals, and 0 second chances. The most dangerous 48 hours of this mission didn't actually start when you and I might think. It started when that electron storm hit days ago, quietly, invisibly, while the world's cameras were looking at something else. And it won't be over until we see those 4 crew members standing on the recovery deck, breathing fresh air above the Pacific. Until that second, the window remains open. Every system, every variable, and every tiny margin is still on the line.